Hello and welcome to our webinar on how to write a research proposal. We're very pleased that you could join us. Firstly, let me introduce myself. My name is Jonathan Lloyd and I work in the university's graduate school, and I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Sue Walker, Director of the Design Star Doctoral Training Centre in our Department of Typography and Graphic Communication, and also by Dr. Graham Cottrell, Director of Postgraduate Research Studies in our School of Pharmacy. So we thought we'd briefly outline what we're intending to cover in this webinar. We're intending to offer some advice to help you to understand more about what is expected in a PhD research proposal. There are some quite significant differences between what is expected from a research proposal in a non-science subject as opposed to a science subject. So for that reason, we've asked Sue to provide some guidance for a proposal in the non-science area and Graham to provide some guidance in the science area. After Sue and Graham have provided some guidance, then we'll move on to answer some of your questions. So you can submit your questions. We're just showing you a slide on the screen there that shows you how to do that through the software. We'll be taking your questions in during the webinar, and then at the end we'll be moving on to answering the questions that we can. If your question is very specific, then we may not be able to answer it during the webinar, but we'll definitely follow up with you afterwards. So that's how to, so do send us a question from this point onwards, that would be great. So now we're going to move on to our first speaker. So I'd like to invite Sue to start us off by providing some information about a research proposal for a non-science subject. So thank you, Sue.
Hello everyone, it's good to talk to you. I want to start with a photograph of some of my Design Star students at a workshop that we ran. It looks as if they're thinking very hard, and they are indeed. And I wanted just to draw attention to the fact that if you're writing a research proposal, you do have to think hard, you have to spend time putting it together. It's not something that you can do very quickly. So I'm going to start with what might seem to be a very obvious subject. What do you want to study? And I think in a proposal, it's a good idea to define first the general area that you want to work in, and then the specific aspect of that study, and then what shortcoming or gap that you see in this area. So to give some examples of this, in my own discipline, for example, a broad area of study might be user-centered design. The specific aspect might be a health-related area, and the problem or shortcoming might be in instructional material for insulin injections. Another example, medieval history might be the general area that you want to work in. The specific area might be magic, and the shortcoming or gap might be words that are used in spells and incantations. So once you've got your general area and your potential topics sorted out, it's a really good idea to get in touch with the university here, to get in touch with the postgraduate director in the department or school that you want to work in. This person will give you good advice, for example, about who might be available to supervise you, and some studentships ask for supervisors in 2 institutions, so we'd be able to provide advice about that as well. Another important area, I think, is to ask this person what other PhD students are working in an area similar to you. I think this gives you an idea of the kind of research culture that you'll be going to work in, and it gives you some idea of the kinds of topics that are already being studied. The postgraduate director might give you advice about potential supervisors, and you can then get in touch with them to talk about your research ideas. And do ask them if they're willing to look at drafts of your proposal. Many are, and it can be very helpful to get that feedback. So when you start to write your proposal, it's important to define a research question or an issue that you want to address. This can be an overarching statement, and then following that, there might be some specific objectives for the research that you want to carry out. And it's good to keep this very focused. You don't want lots of objectives, so keep it down. And then you need to explain why your research is significant, why it matters. And this is where I think you can demonstrate awareness of the research that's in the area that you want to work in. It provides you with opportunity to talk about the context, what work has been done, what will you add to this work, and this allows you to give a very brief survey of other literature, other projects of which you know about. And a really important part of your proposal is about the way in which you intend to work, the research methods that you plan to use. In many arts and humanities topics, this is going to involve some kind of literature review. So you want to be able to articulate the kind of literature review that you want to study. Is this going to be within a discipline, or is it going to be across disciplines? In some arts and humanities topics, you might be wanting to do interviews and questionnaires. You might be analysing text. You might be reviewing and analysing material in archives and collections. You need to say how you're going to do these things, not just list what you want to do. And it can also be helpful to explain what relevant skills and experience you have in running these techniques. And sometimes, for example, you'll have done some archival research in an MA dissertation or thesis that you've written, and this can be really good evidence that you know what you're talking about. So do feel that you can refer to these things. It's also, when you're talking about your methods and the way that you're going to work, good to think about whether there are particular ethical issues. If you're using human participants, you need to think what you need to decide whether this is reasonable and effective and how many people you'd need to work with. It's good to foresee any particular challenges. If you're doing archival work, have you been in touch with the archives to see that they'll allow you access? Is this going to be, are there going to be problems that are going to be getting in the way of how you're going to complete your research? Another important aspect, I think, and one that you can use to really demonstrate that your proposal is giving the right messages to Reading, is to give some thought to why Reading's right for you. And this might be, for instance, there are particular collections at Reading that are going to be helpful to your work. There might be a particular research group. For example, there is a research centre in Beckett studies. So if you're wanting to do work on Samuel Beckett, then you need to find out what work's going on already and what advantages there might be to studying with colleagues in the Beckett Research Centre. Reading is also very supportive of cross-disciplinary research. Our research is structured under themes that cross different interests in the university, and it might be that your proposal is one that is drawing on disciplines that are outside arts and humanities. And again, Reading might provide the support that you need for such a topic. And it's important to include in your plan, in your proposal, some notion of when you're going to do things. So you need to start by working out what you're going to do initially, what you're going to do in the first year, second year, and third year of your work. Now, it's likely in reality that this will change, and when you start working, you'll want to move things into slightly different time zones. But I think it's a good discipline for you to start thinking how much time you need to do certain aspects of the work that are in your study. Including, I've mentioned when you're defining context for your work, you need to think about the work that's been going on, and this is where you can include list of sources and references that are going to be relevant to your work, and it's evidence here that you know the topic, but you need to provide information that's very accurate, very clear, and very complete. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about how you present the information in your thesis. You need to write clearly. You need to write for readers that aren't specialists in your field. It's helpful when you're doing this to keep your sentences short, to use headings and subheadings. And something that people forget to do is number the pages. It seems very obvious, but it's very helpful for people that are reading it. It's useful, or can be helpful, to use lists and tables. That can be a way of presenting information concisely and clearly. And it's important to check, if you're entering a studentship competition, how many words you're allowed. It tends to vary, so this is something that you need to talk with somebody at the university here about. And finally, get somebody to proofread. It doesn't go down well if there are lots of spelling mistakes and other errors. In some theses, it's helpful to have illustrations. If, for example, you're doing a practice-based research project, it's likely that you'll want to use illustrations to show that the kind of work that you want to produce. You can include these as an appendix, or you can include them as part of the text. And you can also use diagrams to explain what you want to do. And again, this can be a very useful way of explaining things concisely and clearly so that you're not taking up too many words. But if you are going to use pictures, please make sure that they're captioned so that they explain what you're trying to show. Well, thank you very much for listening to me. I'm now going to hand over to Graham, who's going to talk about PhD proposal in the sciences, which is a slightly different approach.
Hello, good morning, everyone from the UK. My name is Dr. Graham Cottrell. I am Director of Postgraduate Research Studies at the School of Pharmacy. And my background is that I'm actually a biochemist and molecular biologist. So I'm now going to give you a brief overview on how to write a research proposal for the sciences. So the first thing to remember is that you may not have to formulate your own proposal. So academics in the sciences are constantly writing grants and applications and may have secured funding in advance. So they will have already written a proposal, and companies and charities and research councils will be providing the monies for that proposal. These types of PhDs are very competitive, so it's very difficult to achieve one of these. So if you are going to write your own proposal, the first thing is to define what area of science you are interested in. Think about what you enjoyed during your undergraduate or your master's studies, and think about what it is that was interesting in that area that you want to now pursue. Once you've highlighted that, the key thing is to find somebody at the university that works in that specific area. There's no point in trying to do research at a particular institute if there's no academic who specializes in that area that is able to supervise you. The next thing that you would want to do is to check that that person that you've identified actually has the time and is willing to supervise you. And for this, you're best to get in touch with the academic directly. So scientific writing tends to be blunt and concise. So avoid overcomplicating the writing with the use of flowery words. The writing lacks artistic enhancements, so sentences tend to be short, to the point, and avoid using direct quotations of sources. When you're doing your research, you should read a paper and write notes on that. Don't copy words directly from the resource. Put the work of others into your own words. Another important point in writing any proposal is to avoid plagiarism. So this is the passing of someone else's work as your own. A lot of this comes from like poor academic practice where students tend to just copy sentences rather than putting the words in the work into their own words. The type of voice that's used in a proposal, there is no correct voice. That you can use active or passive voice, and they are commonly interchanged to stop the text from becoming a little bit dull and boring. So a scientific proposal consists of several sections. First thing is you need to think about is your title. So the title shouldn't be too long, that it's sort of maybe 30, 40 words long. It should be descriptive and to the point. It should tell the reader exactly what you're trying to investigate. The first thing that you should research is the introduction. So this is the background. So this is going to tell the reader exactly what is known currently in the field. And then you will go on to then introduce your research hypothesis. So what is your question? What are you testing? Again, this hypothesis that should then be followed by certain objectives or aims. After that, you would move on to your methodology. So how are you going to test your hypothesis? What type of experiments are you going to perform? And finally, you should finish with what are the expected outcomes. So once you've performed your research, what will your research discover? What will be its impact? And finally, all good proposals will be referenced properly. So here we have a section where you will have highlighted in the text where your information has come from. So you're backing up your ideas. So one of the common questions that we get is how long should the proposal be? And as with the non-sciences, there is no fixed length, and it is always best to check requirements with the school or department that you're applying to. But a good proposal can typically be between 2,000 and 4,000 words. And again, you should always check requirements, but this often means that the references, figure legends, and any text in tables is not counted in your figure legend, in your word count. A picture paints 1,000 words, so it's often very appropriate to use figures in your text. This will help the reader visualize what you're trying to do. The figure should always be accompanied by a caption or figure legend that should clearly describe everything that is present in the figure. So if you're demonstrating in the science, say a signaling pathway, any protein that's in the figure should be described. You shouldn't have anything in the figure that you're not describing in your figure legend. And again, I can't say this enough times, is check the instructions before you write your proposal. And especially if you're going to start to apply for international scholarships at the university, then again, these will have different requirements and you should really check these out. So here we have a nice picture of a PhD student and their supervisor in the School of Biological Sciences doing some work on a confocal microscope. I guess these guys are looking at some cells. So where do you find the information for your proposal? Well, the first thing is to look at the literature databases. And a couple of these could be PubMed, Google Scholar, but it's often appropriate just to do a regular Google search because this can often pick up papers that maybe you'll miss. So it's important before you start to generate a library of resources or references in that area. And for this, you should use a reference manager software. So this is a piece of software that will collate all your references so that you can insert them into your text, and then it will automatically generate a reference list for you at the end. My suggestion would be to write a literature review to start your proposal. What is known in the area? What is not known? This will also help you to formulate your hypothesis, which will often develop and change as you write your proposal. Once you have your hypothesis, you then need to think about how you're going to test it. So what experimental methods are you going to use? Again, it's always important that you do research on these methods to make sure that you're using the most up-to-date methods. What type of equipment will you need? Again, this is an important aspect, because if you plan to do something with a very specialized piece of equipment that is not even present at the university, then unfortunately we're not going to be able to conduct your research at the university of your choice. You need to think about general experimental design. So what control experiments are you going to need? How many times are you going to repeat the experiment to determine whether your result is significant? And then once you've actually conducted the experiments, how are you going to test whether they are actually significant? And for this, you need to look into any statistical tests that you may need to do. Another thing with experiments is that many people want to do what we call in vivo experiments, or experiments involving animals. So it's always important to determine beforehand whether these types of experiments can be conducted in the UK. Finally, it's always make sure that when you've described your experiments, that they are achievable in 3 years. So a normal PhD will last about three years in the laboratory, and it's important that the amount of work that you describe in your proposal is achievable in those 3 years. Often we'll get students who are a little bit over ambitious and try to do too much. Remember that in your first year, you will probably be doing a lot of training and becoming accustomed to doing certain types of technique. Finally, we have the expected outcomes section. In this, you should cover how your research will advance the current knowledge. What will be the impact of your results? Will it change the decision making of the country? Are your results likely to be generalized? Can they be applied to other fields as well? Will you be identifying a new drug target? What avenues of research will your results open? Where will you go next? So after you've done your 3 years of work in the laboratory, what results do you expect to achieve? And where would you go next? It's worth thinking about this a lot. So why is your hypothesis worth investing in? Again, certainly in the sciences, if you've identified a new drug technique, a new drug target, will industry be involved in this? Will they be interested to pursue this further? Again, this could then help you in your future career of going on to maybe do a postdoctoral fellow. All proposals must be referenced. You should always use one style and do not interchange. A suggestion here would be, if it's a short proposal, would be to use Vancouver, which is with the numbers. This will reduce the number of words in your text, allowing you to write more for your proposal if the constraints are quite high. Always use the most up-to-date references you can. On the other hand, it's also important to cite original work. So if somebody carried out the original work that you're citing many, many years ago, you should always go back to that original reference. And here you should avoid generalizing and using reviews unless it's just for a general discussion. A common mistake is that people use reviews far too often, and therefore when people go back and they look at your reference list, they then have to go through the review to find the work that was the original work. So I'll now hand you over to Jonathan Lloyd, who's going to summarize the webinar. And please send in your questions and we will hopefully get back to you soon. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Graham. Thanks also to Sue. We hope you found that useful. We've just got a couple of slides now just to help summarise some of the things that Graham and Sue have been talking about, and also to signpost you to some other resources which we think you might find useful. So the length and the format of a research proposal obviously depends very much on your subject of interest, so it's something that you need to be aware of. You need to look also, we suggest, at the department's research areas, which you can find on our website. There's quite a lot of information about our research activities and expertise there, where you can also find staff profiles of individual academic members of staff here, potential PhD supervisors. So you may find it very helpful there to have a look at those profiles. We're very happy at Reading for you to contact the academic staff directly. You can email them and introduce yourself and start a discussion with them about a PhD project that you've got in mind. It's not necessary for you to identify a supervisor before you apply. You obviously can do, but it's not a requirement. So if you say were to apply for a PhD here, we would help you to find a supervisor with the appropriate expertise. That's part of the process of our admissions procedure. We have some guidance on how to write a research proposal on our website, which you can click on that link there and it should take you through later. We advise that you have a look at this before you apply and take on board the suggestions that are made there. We do have on that same page some detailed specific guidance on particular areas, and that's something that we're continuing to develop. So do have a look there as well. And just onto the second slide. So just a general thing, please make sure when you submit your proposal to us that you have covered the what, the why, and the how of your proposed research. It must include that. As already been mentioned, please check the spelling and the grammar and make sure you include any references. That's really important. The graduate school website, which has a host of very useful information about PhD study, also lists a number of PhD project ideas, so PhD projects that we're looking to actually do that have been advertised by our supervisors. You may find that helpful to have a look at there just to get ideas. Maybe it's a starting point for a conversation. Maybe there's a project there you're really interested in. This is across a number of areas, but it's not in absolutely every area, but do have a look at that. Also, another resource that you may find useful is we have online copies of all of the PhD theses that have been recently awarded at the university, and you can find that by clicking on this link, which will take you through to our university repository called Centaur, where you can search there for theses in your area of interest, and also other publications from people at the University of Reading. And finally, do have a look at the graduate school website. There's a host of information there about how to apply, funding, and much more. It's a really good resource, so we do suggest you have a look at that. And now we're going to move on to see if we have any questions. We just wanted to talk about one question or a couple of questions that people have asked. One, we can certainly provide you with all of the slides from this presentation. That would be absolutely fine, as well as the recording of this webinar. So that's absolutely no problem at all. We commonly get asked, when should I apply? Now, it's advised that international applicants should apply a minimum of 3 months before they're intending to start. We have PhD start points in September, in January, and in April. So there is some flexibility there in terms of when you might wish to start. So definitely get in your application at least 3 months before. In terms of how long an application might take to be processed, it does take a number of weeks to be considered by the appropriate academic staff and to come up with a decision. So you just need to be aware that it does take several weeks. So we have another question here about whether it's possible to approach potential supervisors with ideas or to wait whether we have a research proposal already developed. And it's absolutely fine to contact a potential supervisor with some draft ideas to say, I'm looking to develop this. Does this look like something that could become a PhD research proposal? And hopefully then the potential supervisor will be able to give you some feedback, or to say, actually, this is in the area of expertise of a colleague, or at least to advise you on how to take that forward. So we've had another similar question about starting an EdD. So that is our professional doctorate in education, which starts in February. How vital is it that we have a fully formed research title before we start the course? I mean, in most cases, we've had sight of a research proposal that we know we can supervise, but I don't think it would be the case that everything is perfect with the proposals. I think there are many situations, if not all, where things are developed as they go along, and sometimes projects can slightly change direction as it evolves, and it becomes clear that some things will work better than others. So that's very much a common part of the process, I think. So we've got a question here about bibliographies. So I'm going to ask perhaps Sue if she wouldn't mind having a look at this one.
Right, this is a question about a bibliography. I think whether you include, there's a terminology issue here. Whether if you're referring to things in the text, you'd need to include a list of references, which is a list of the things that you refer to. In my area, a bibliography would be a slightly different thing, which would be a list of material that shows that you're aware of the broad context of your area of study, but you might not have referred to them in the text. So it's fine to have a bibliography if that's appropriate to your research topic, but in many cases it will be a list of references.
So there's a question about funding for PhD study, and is it possible to discuss this with somebody? At the end, we'll be providing you with some contact details. In fact, I think they're on this slide, of how to get in touch with us. And I think we'd suggest that you email gradschool@reading.ac.uk with questions that you have about funding, and then I will come back to you on that with the information that we're able to provide on that. We've had another question about possibly transferring from another university to the University of Reading for a PhD, and that is something that is possible, but obviously we'd need to have a discussion about how far through your PhD you are, and whether we have the expertise, obviously, to pick up the supervision there. And obviously there'd be other discussions, and we'd want to obviously try and discuss with you about your project and potentially meet you if we can, or have a Skype chat. So again, that is something that we can certainly explore. If you'd like to send us an email, we can certainly take that discussion further. So we've had a question about accessing the recording and the slides. Yes, both of these will be available after the webinar has finished, so we can provide you with those, so you can recap and look back at anything here that you would find useful. We've had another question about whether an application would be weak if we haven't got consent or agreement from a potential supervisor already. And I'm just going to pass the microphone over to Graham and ask if he could answer this one.
I think if you have a proposal already written and you haven't identified a supervisor, then I think that's just part of the normal process. Obviously, we're here to help you. So what you should do is apply through the normal routes, but it would be worth to get in touch with the school or departmental director of postgraduate studies, who can then hopefully help you identify somebody within that department who would be willing to supervise it. Obviously, it would be helpful if beforehand you would look on the university web pages. So look at the academics in that department, look at what they research. So if you can identify a couple of people who could possibly support you, then this would obviously improve the strength of your application, but not only just the strength, but it would probably speed things up. We can, as I said, help you identify, because what's always useful is once you've written a proposal would be to send it to the academic that you're interested in working with, who will be able to give you some input and some feedback on that. That will again then improve the strength of your final application.
I see there's a question for me here, and I said that writing should be written as if the reader is not a specialist. Could you clarify why, if we're submitting it to a department full of specialists? That's a very good question. The reason that I made this point was that research proposals are read by more than one person, and while your supervisor or proposed supervisor might be somebody that really knows the ins and outs of a particular area of a particular discipline, there might be other people, even within the same department, that don't have the degree of specialism that is necessary. So it needs to be written very, very clearly. And indeed, for some studentship competitions, and I'm talking now about studentships funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, it's quite likely that the proposal would be read by somebody outside of your own discipline. So it needs to be, your proposal needs to be written so that it's accessible to non-specialists as well as those that are very well versed in the subject that you're writing about.
Okay, we've had a really good response on the questions here. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to answer all of them live now, but we will get back to all of you individually. Just before we finish, there's a question here asking about whether we accept an undergraduate first degree for admission to a PhD, which is a really good question and one we get quite often. So the general requirement for a PhD in the science areas is a minimum of a 2-1 upper second bachelor's degree. For a PhD in the sciences, often people will jump across from a bachelor's to a PhD directly. A number of students also do have a master's, which obviously is a higher qualification, but it's not an absolute requirement. If you're applying for funding, it may help you to be standing out from the crowd a bit if you do have a master's, and that enhances your first degree. In the non-sciences, it's generally the case that you will actually require a master's degree in the discipline that you're looking onto to develop into a PhD. So that's often how it works at the University of Reading. So we'd like to thank you very much for joining us this morning. As I say, we will get back to everybody who's asked us a question, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. It's been great to have Sue and Graham with us this morning, and we hope you found this webinar useful. And as we've said, do get in contact with us in a number of ways that we've given on the last slide, and have a great day.